Hi, good afternoon and good morning to all our distinguished guests and participants for this two-day long conference on strategic high tide in the Indo-Pacific, ecology and security. After having a very thought-provoking inaugural session, which actually has set the perfect tone for our session, we are about to start our first business session on geopolitics and security. And I'm very pleased to moderate this session for the next 1.5 hours. Well, we all know how the term Indo-Pacific is gaining currency as a new construct in the recent times, with various countries using it in their official statements. In fact, Pacific refers to the wide geographical expanse combining the Indian and Pacific Oceans. While looking at the genesis, we see that Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, launched the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Initiative in 2016 to develop the Indo-Pacific as a region of shared cooperative endeavor. Well, over the years, the Indo-Pacific has become a part of US national strategy, as well as received strong support from Australia. Majors operating in this geographical space, such as the USA, Japan, and Australia, who are interested in maintaining stability and a rule-based order in the region, have also begun to perceive India as an emerging power in this region, and have encouraged India's prominent role given its geographic centrality in the Indian Ocean. Having been in use in Indian policy circles for years, the nomenclature gained a clear meaning and vision from our Prime Minister Narendra Modi's keynote speech at Shangri-La Dialogue in June 2018. Further, he highlighted that India has been an active participant in mechanisms like the East Asia Summit, Association of Southeast Asian Nations Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, ASEAN Regional Forum, the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, and Mekong-Ganga Economic Corridor. India also convenes the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. Through the Forum for India-Pacific Islands Cooperation, India is moving towards engaging with Pacific Island countries as well. India's multi-layered engagement with China, as well as its strategic partnership with Russia, is key to ensuring stable, open, secure, inclusive, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. And in recent times, beyond the Indian Ocean, the Western Pacific has been identified as being within the ambit of India's security interests. And also it has evident where Indian Navy is being engaged with the countries such as Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, and Japan. Having rapidly become a center of gravity for global politics, the Indo-Pacific region offers a plethora of opportunities for aspiring South and Southeast Asian countries, while at the same time posing challenges and challenges with respect to regional as well as global stability. The assertive expansion of China, rising concerns regarding climate change, and the need for adaptive as well as efficient modes of economic exchanges have expanded the scope for multilateral as well as particularly multilateral collaborations among regional and also extra-regional actors. In this context, this session would deliberate on a few questions that we have highlighted. These questions are, what are the prospects for functional cooperation in the Indo-Pacific? How do you define Indo-Pacific order? In fact, this question has been posed during our inaugural session. And also the next one, do you think the time has come to go towards institutionalization of the entire concept of Indo-Pacific? How and also would geopolitical tensions contribute to increase securitization of this geopolitical space for new alliances like AUKUS, Blue Dot Network, and the Quad Plus? In your mind, in your perceptions, what are the new notions of threat and security in these changing dynamics of Indo-Pacific, and how all these stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific can actually engage China while dealing with these new notions of threat and security? So on and on and on. I'm sure these issues will be covered by our distinguished speakers, but of course we will not be confined within these issues. Many other issues may come in. So discuss all these issues. We have today a galaxy of distinguished speakers. We have Dhruva Jaishankar, Executive Director, Observer Research Foundation, America. We have with us Colin Postway-Lin, Research Fellow, Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, is Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore. We have Satuli Mai, Vice President and Director, East-West Center, USA. I think he will be joining us very soon. We have with us Shruti Pandalai, Associate Fellow, Manohar Panikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. Then we are pleased to have with us today Daisuke Kawai, Research Fellow, Indo-Pacific Affairs, the Japan Institute of International Affairs, Japan. And we have with us Akriti Vasudeva, Research Analysis with the South Asia Program of the Stimson Center, and Editor at Large at South Asia Voice, USA. Well, I'll follow the same order that it appears in the booklet, and will request all our distinguished within 8 minutes to share their views in the first round. Then we will collect some questions, and our discussion will go on and on and on within 1 hour and 30 minutes. So it's over to you, Dhruv.
Thank you, and thank you to ORF Kolkata and the government of Japan for organizing this. It's a real pleasure to be with so many friends on this panel, Shruti and Colin and Akriti, and nice to meet Daisuke and many others. I thought I would restrict myself to a few points. One is, I think, broadly speaking, the idea of the Indo-Pacific as a strategic construct has now taken root. It is now very much inserted into the vocabulary of many countries. Starting, Japan was really at the forefront of it, along with Australia, and then India, then eventually the US. In fact, the US was a latecomer to the notion. It was only under the Trump administration. But eventually, of course, ASEAN, many European countries now have released their Indo-Pacific strategies or visions. So, in some ways, this is now a sort of recognized reality. I would argue that the genesis of the contemporary Indo-Pacific as a strategic concept really arose in late 2008, when we saw the first sustained Chinese military activity in the Indian Ocean in many centuries. At that time, the context was anti-piracy operations off of East Africa in the Gulf of Aden. But ever since then, we've effectively had a permanent Chinese presence there. And the fact that today China and also Japan have now essentially a permanent presence in the Indian Ocean means today that there is the stark reality where the Pacific and Indian Oceans are part of a single strategic continuum. And for countries like India, it will mean it has been recognizing and adapting to these new realities. It isn't simply a security construct, as has been pointed out. There's obviously been economic and institutional and political aspects that have linked historically and more recently this extended region together. And the fact that for India, some of its most important trading and economic partners, China, Japan, South Korea, ASEAN, are part of this space is of course important. I'll just try and limit. Again, we've some excellent speakers, and I'd love to. I look forward to hearing from all of them on different aspects of this issue, including some of the questions. But I thought I would focus for a few minutes on the Japan-India aspect of cooperation, in particular. In some ways, Japan and India, particularly strategic relations between Japan and India, have come a very long way in a very short amount of time. It was really after the year 2000 that Japan and India started forming something close to a normal defense and security relationship, and it is involved overcoming a lot of hurdles in both countries, as well as international institutional constraints as well. And so, really, with Prime Minister Modi's visit to India in 2000, kick-started a slow and a process that accelerated after 2006 and again after 2014 to basically construct a security relationship between the two countries that was motivated by shared concerns primarily about China. And you do have a continuing China-India boundary dispute, and that has intensified over the last 2 years, as well as a continuing territorial dispute between China and Japan in the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. So that has certainly been a major animating factor for both countries' security profiles and postures. But it has also served the purpose of bringing the two countries together. Additionally, there are shared concerns about a relative vacuum created by the United States, which is keen to work with allies and partners to share a burden in an increasingly contested world and an increasingly contested Indo-Pacific. And in Japan and India have found partners that have the willingness and capability to work together on some of these challenges. On the bilateral relationship, on the Japan-India bilateral relationship, I'd say there are two aspects that have been particularly promising and have progressed quite well. One is in terms of strategic coordination between the two. And while we had initial staff talks in the early 2000s, today you have a full-fledged 2+2 foreign and defense ministers dialogue, as well as working level contacts on a regular and sustained basis between the governments and the militaries of the two countries. So that's, I think, one area that has been very promising and has witnessed a good deal of progress. The other has been the military-to-military contacts, particularly between the two, between the Japanese SDF, the Self-Defense Forces, and the Indian military across all three major services, ground forces, air force, and Navy. The naval contacts have been the most well-developed, and you now have regular GMEX bilateral exercises, as well as Malabar exercises involving the US and now Australia, and perhaps other countries in the future. The Army and Air Force exercises really got off the ground after 2018. And so, you have a certain degree of trilateral coordination and observers in each other's exercises and so forth. So I would say those are the two aspects of the relationship that have taken off from almost zero 20 years ago to something reasonably meaningful and in the last few years. But there's a lot more work that needs to be done. There is work on potentially joint exercises, which India has now embarked upon with Russia, the US, and now the UK. Japan is a promising partner for that. Developing each other's expeditionary capabilities, given, again, the strategic context in which both Japan and India operate. Exploring more options for training, including cadet training, which is very difficult for a number of reasons, including schedules, language, but also mid-career training, widening mid-career training options, and intelligence cooperation as well. So I think these are all areas that remain relatively underdeveloped. While some initial work has taken place, it is not progressed as quickly. A major area, unfortunately, of where we haven't seen much progress has been on defense, trade, and technology issues. And while there was some promise and some exploration of on that front, that hasn't taken off for a number of reasons to do with the two countries' own defense industries, their sort of inability to work together, finding common projects that sort of meet both their requirements, addressing issues such as cost. And I think ultimately also, I'd say another area that is really, I think, expected, we hope, to get there, I think, at some point is in terms of contingency planning for specific scenarios, in a similar way that Japan and the US have over the last several decades developed a much closer relationship and are actively working together on very specific scenario planning. At some stage, we will reach, I think, a level of comfort and where Japan and India can work together more on more specific contingencies. Finally, in terms of future cooperation, I'd say two areas I think perhaps deserving of greater attention. One is sort of cooperation on hardening systems, particularly in an era of network-centric warfare. So, working together on secure hardware and software, on hardening cyber security in terms of space cooperation. So I think that's one area that is sort of ripe for further development. There is some dialogue in those areas, but certainly a lot more can be done and would actually tap the comparative advantages that both Japan and India have to offer. And finally, another area would be, and this is not strictly in the military realm, but has very important security implications, has been coordination in terms of overseas development assistance in third countries. And this is something, again, it's a major strength that Japan has. It's ODA, and India is also getting into that game in some ways and has now a not insignificant amount that it provides to other countries. So finding areas where they can work together. There was the one project that was supposed to be to lead this off was in Sri Lanka, that has been bogged down in a number of local political challenges, but certainly there's much further room to explore cooperation in that domain. So with that, I look forward to others' remarks, and thank you again for inviting me.
Thanks, Duba, for sharing your views, and you have highlighted mostly the various aspects of Japan-India relationship, and you have also talked about several important domains where we can further think of expanding our ties. We know that. The notion or the concept or the construct of Indo-Pacific has ASEAN centrality, which is very important in this context to understand what Southeast Asian countries actually perceive about Indo-Pacific. So I would request my friend Colin to share his views on Indo-Pacific, and specifically if he can share his ideas or share his views on how the Southeast Asian nations actually think of Indo-Pacific. Do they have any integrated idea or consolidated idea of Indo-Pacific, or it's really scattered among all the Southeast Asian nations? It's over to you, Colin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anaswa, and allow me to thank ORF and the government of Japan for inviting me. It's a great honor to be on the panel, and not least because I have familiar faces. I have friends here. It's been quite some time. I seek your understanding if I happen to break up somehow because of the internet connection. I hope it doesn't fail me when I speak for the next 8 minutes at least. But no, since I was given the task of looking at Southeast Asia, I also will seek your understanding that I don't speak for all Southeast Asian countries because, as you know, this is a very diverse region. It is diverse, it's complex, and basically you don't have what we will deem as have here 10 countries and they are represented by their specific unique national interests. So Dr. Anaswa asked about the question about whether there is a concerted concept on the Indo-Pacific. And of course, most of you here will be aware of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific that was being proposed in 2019. It was adopted and it came about because various stewards within ASEAN, Indonesia. Indonesia is a key proponent of a joint outlook on the Indo-Pacific for Southeast Asian countries. So it took pains to go around the various capitals to sort of, get a sense of what it's like when it comes to the various national perspectives, and thereby the product was born. It was in fact quite surprising because these AOIP came about, within a rather short timetable from the past, initiatives that were put forth in ASEAN. And the urgency of this particular outlook came about because of the sense of, the intensified geopolitical dynamics that revolve around this term Indo-Pacific, right? So Southeast Asian countries, if there is any one uniting factor to think about, is that they do not want to be forced to choose, right? Now, misunderstanding that AOIP will serve as the sort of keystone guideline for ASEAN countries, and that might potentially be taken as a joint or common foreign policy document of ASEAN member states. But that is not exactly very true. I mean, that is merely, if I could call that, a set of principles that the ASEAN member states could rely on, they could fall back on, and their own national policies. So when they approach their own national policies on the Indo-Pacific, they do take into account the AOIP, but by no means AOIP dictates their national policies regarding the Indo-Pacific. So therefore, you find there are ASEAN countries that embrace the term Indo-Pacific very, very openly. For example, Indonesia has been talking about the Indo-Pacific very openly, very publicly, and to some extent, Vietnam does that. But however, if you look at some of the other, even Vietnam, for example, at some point of time, you'll find that, they still use the term Asia Pacific, right? So there is no uniform application of the AOIP as far as we are aware of 2 years after the AOIP was first being developed. Now, I thought this is a good segue into what I really want to talk about when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. And of course, the Quad could be given some respite, comes in and it sort of takes the heat off the Quad, at least for now, right? And most of the attention is on AUKUS and its impact on security. And of course, much like many years ago when the Quad was first being announced, Southeast Asia finds itself in a very peculiar position, right? I mean, I will focus on what I call the coalitions of the willing in the Indo-Pacific context, and how it eventually may impact Asia. I think it's very clear after almost 2 months now since AUKUS was announced that there is no common position per se on AUKUS. Now, if you look at the very recent ASEAN summit, you'll find there is some very nuanced differences, right? So one is that in the ASEAN-Australia joint statement after the summit, there is a mention of AUKUS, but in the ASEAN summit chair statement, there is no mention of AUKUS. So it appears that ASEAN member states, they have taken a pretty strong position on AUKUS, but it's by no means to say that there is a common, or I would say consensus position, amongst ASEAN member states on AUKUS, and so that may explain why there is an absence of the mention of AUKUS in the eventual chair statement after the ASEAN summits. And what was interesting also is to note that, while there are some member states quite strongly against AUKUS, and Indonesia and Malaysia being the two countries that were largely in the limelight for that purpose. But we also have on the other end of the spectrum, countries like the Philippines, Singapore being at least positive in the overall tone. And of course, being Vietnam has been very ambiguous, but if you look between the lines of its official statement on AUKUS, you could sense that there is at least an acquiescence to AUKUS, if not outright. And there is here, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific issues, the various competing Indo-Pacific vision, we have no united ASEAN position beyond the AOIP. And so far we see national positions being taken, and by no means is to say that the coalitions of the willing, such as AUKUS or the Quad, for example, are unwelcome in Southeast Asia. If you look at it, I think it's important to look at the realities today. And it brings me back to a point of many presentations these days is, the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, essentially, the COVID-19 pandemic would have changed the texture of the geopolitical dynamics and landscape that we see over here. Now, while some will argue that Southeast Asian countries could not wean off their reliance on China more from the economic benefits, but it's also to say that the pandemic also heightened especially with growing China and a continued persistent assertiveness of China. At the same time, the prevailing focus on pandemic control and economic recovery would mean that ASEAN countries continue to place a premium on extra-regional presence in the region, right? And therefore, AUKUS still has currency in that. It's seen not wholly in a positive light per se. I mean, there are concerns. I mean, for example, whether AUKUS could lead to, the heightening of, geopolitical dynamics between the various major and middle powers involved, and whether it will, fuel an arms race. These are legitimate concerns, but by no means, if you look at the context here, it's nothing new. I mean, these are concerns have been raised before, but generally, I would encourage, all of us to look beyond the policy rhetoric in Southeast Asia towards actions. So imagine if Indonesia and Malaysia are so against AUKUS, then there could be other stronger ways to express the discontent. But so far, beyond the talk about, the concerns of arms race and instability, we have seen Indonesia and Malaysia continue to enhance and maintain their existing defense and security relations with Australia and the other powers, including the US. And what is most notable is that Indonesia engaged in its regular coordinated maritime patrol with Australia. And of course, just last week, they concluded their joint bilateral naval exercise, New Horizon, right? So Indonesia obviously wants to continue with a security cooperation with Australia because, AUKUS may be a concern, but ultimately the net benefits of engaging Australia, US, and other extra-regional powers like India for its strategic interests, right? And likewise for Malaysia, just earlier this week, it has signed on to an MOU with Australia on cybersecurity. And then you have to ask yourself this question: will you sign an MOU on cybersecurity, which is a sensitive area of cooperation with somebody you don't trust and you don't count on, right? So obviously, if you look beyond the rhetoric, generally we are down to a set pattern that we saw in Southeast Asia, that Southeast Asian, if major powers and stakeholders in the region will come up with new initiatives like AUKUS, the only way is to coexist along them, at the same time trying to assert and even reassert ASEAN centrality in terms of trying to manage these geopolitical rivalries. So I think going forward, in terms of security cooperation, I don't think new setups such as AUKUS or even the Quad, for example, will have serious ramifications consequences that can impinge upon security cooperation with Southeast Asian countries. On the contrary, because of the pandemic situation, we're going to see AUKUS, the Quad, and other Indo-Pacific setups to become more salient going forward. So with that, I end my brief presentation and look forward to our discussion later. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Colin, for sharing your views. In fact, we have visited extensively, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, and Myanmar in relation to our maritime connectivity and security projects. And we wanted to understand, ASEAN centrality from their own perceptions. And we have got the same idea which you actually reiterated through your presentation, that there is no, integrated or unified ASEAN, concept of Indo-Pacific per se, because each and every countries, they have their own perception towards their own national interest against the backdrop of Indo-Pacific. And thank you so much also for sharing your vision towards Malaysia, Indonesia, towards Indo-Pacific. I'm just thinking how we can relate the notion of institutionalization. We have got this question from Australian Consul General in the inaugural session. When she has raised this issue, how far or to what extent we can go beyond this geographical construct and have kind of institutionalization in the geographical domain of Indo-Pacific. I would request Shruti, if you can take up this idea, or you can start with your own views as well. Shruti, it's over to you.
Hello, thank you very much for having me, both to the government of Japan as well as the Observer Research Foundation. This has been a very engaging conversation. I'm very happy to see friends and new colleagues here. And I hope we get to do this in person soon. I'll address your question, Ansuya, but I think, if I may put this out there, Dhruva and Colin have done a great job of sort of painting the greater canvas of the current subject. But, I think somewhere all of us have argued that flexibility has remained an asset here in terms of how we are reimagining cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So an overemphasis on institutionalization should be always taken with caution. However, let me just start by saying that, for some of us who've been working on this issue for a while, the momentum in the Indo-Pacific has been long in the making, with many countries actually working in various permutations and combinations to ensure common baselines emerge for cooperation in the region. This is important because the main aim was to work towards an equitable rule-based global order where unilateralism does not go unchecked, and India is in the best place to tell you that. So as China ups its stake for global leadership, the turbulent waters of the Indo-Pacific continue to be a focal point for strategic competition. So any other sort of expectations for future burden-sharing arrangements will require leading powers to show up more often and provide credible signals of political will as well as demonstrate capability. So when I saw the questions that you have raised, for me, the current trends in the Indo-Pacific capture the very issues that you've been talking about, whether it's rebalancing of security and economic cooperation with the rise of militarization in the region, finding avenues for functional cooperation, and of course, a reimagining of security, especially in the post-COVID-19 era, where we are talking about security in broader sort of conceptualization of human security. Now, I've argued before that, that most of these efforts are aimed at building habits of cooperation, especially what we've seen in the Indo-Pacific region among like-minded countries. And these are developing in parallel tracks and are not mutually exclusive. So I look forward to dwelling on this in a few minutes using some of the initiatives that India has advanced itself in the region. Now, if one were to look at trends, trend one would be that with the old global multilateral order sort of failing to manage rising challenges, we have seen the issue-based coalitions where function not form drive engagement are rising and have become the arenas of functional cooperation, as you put it. There is a growing realization that countries coming together in various formats, you call it minilaterals, plurilaterals, and what have you, from various geographies, with a focused sort of lines of effort in economic, security, tech, and strategic arenas would be more productive than depending on the current fractured and non-delivering instruments of global governance. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the flexibility of these very groupings is their biggest asset. The second trend that, is becoming more and more obvious is that the congruence of overlapping in bilateral, multilateral, as well as plurilateral formats. I'm sorry, is this message for me where it says that we can't seem to see you? Okay, thank you. There's a chat window that propped up. Apologies. Anyway, so as I was saying that, you've seen a congruence of efforts overlapping in bilateral, minilateral, and plurilateral platforms towards expansion or sort of global way that they are institutionalized within the national agendas of regional like-minded powers. Now, there is for example, since India's infrastructure diplomacy is deeply connected with its development assistance programs in the neighborhood, new avenues for cooperation are emerging in this very arena. Three, there has been an increasing contestation between democratic countries and authoritarian systems sharpen in the primary theater of the Indo-Pacific. So within this context, middle powers are looking at building habits of cooperation, which while responding to the threat of rising and a very aggressive superpower, go beyond binaries and focus on capacity building. This refers to something that Colin said, thereby giving all nations, big and small in the region, viable alternatives that help them exercise their own agencies. So the new priorities of the post-COVID world, whether it's health security, vaccine development, digital delivery, green growth, and non-predatory infrastructure development, are all falling in this arena. From the Indian prerogative, the Indian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister have often said that India's approach is based on cooperation and collaboration, given that the need for shared responses to shared challenges in the region. So New Delhi has also maintained that the theatre gives India an opportunity to showcase its abilities to be a leading power with its willingness to step up and lead global conversations and initiatives from their inception. So the foreign minister often puts it this way, that, the Indo-Pacific is actually a bread and butter expression of our political, economic, connectivity, travel, and societal interests. And therefore, this relies heavily on ensuring a safe and secure maritime domain. It's, he's called it the India way in the Indo-Pacific. And we've seen, how India imagines this in the time of the COVID-19 crisis. We've sort of seen healthcare emerge as a strategic asset. You've seen India be a first responder and provider first responder in the Indian Ocean region. We've also seen leveraging of bilateral relations to strengthen India-led multilateral initiatives in the wider Indo-Pacific region, as well as showcasing India's ability to get the global north, south, east, and west on the table. Now, getting down to the brass tacks, there are many examples of the linkages of trends that I've spoken earlier. For example, India, with its blueprint for the Indo-Pacific, the Security and Growth for All, or SAGAR as it's called, as I've said, sought to leverage its bilateral relations to bolster multilateral plans, including the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. You have the International Solar Alliance, the Global Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and now the recently announced Infrastructure for the Resilient Island States. Now, the Prime Minister launched this initiative for developing infrastructure for small island states, and India's space agency, ISRO, will build special data windows for them to provide timely information on various, maritime challenges. Now, this effort, if you see, is collaborative because it's a subset of the India-UK Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Similarly, we've seen with the International Solar Alliance and the UK's Green Grid initiative have come together to unveil plans for the first international network of global interconnected solar power grids to accelerate clean energy transition. This project is set to drive global interconnectivity across the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia while leveraging African power tools. Again, this has happened because India and the UK sort of have come together, and the UK pledged technical, financial, and research support for the project. We can also see that under the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, we have seen countries like Australia, Japan, ASEAN member states all come together to, bring in their strengths to find innovative solutions to a variety of challenges that the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, driven by India, seeks to address. We've also seen that, especially the security front, where I say that, on are running on parallel tracks. We've seen plurilateral and bilateral exercises both by the Indian Navy and Coast Guard for several years have helped build confidence, achieve interoperability, as always also evolve sort of standard operating procedures in the region. Now, we have seen the white information exchange happening. We have seen through the Fusion Center at Gurgaon, and we've seen that many countries have already participated and several are signing up for it as well. India's maritime domain awareness initiatives, again, are a case in point, as well as another example of practical efforts at cooperation would be India assisting countries with hydrographic survey support for charting of water, etc. Now, where is cooperation necessary, and perhaps the way forward where we need to talk about this a little more is achieve coordinated efforts to help increase capacity of small island states in the Indo-Pacific to safeguard their resources. And, here again, this includes training of coast guards, maritime security officials, developing legal skills, preparing them to handle the blue economy, etc., arenas that, we need to work more on. Connectivity, again, has become a very, very contested word in today's strategic space. So India, especially in the Indo-Pacific, has tried to synergize efforts in the neighborhood and beyond to provide viable alternatives. This is important to India because it helps energizing its domestic industry as well as to take the lead and ensure standard setting. For example, India has emerged as a reliable cross-border electricity provider to Nepal and South Asian partners. But it's important to remember how this has happened, that this agreement came about because it was a prerequisite for the implementation of the US Millennium Challenge Cooperation Grant to Nepal, under which, if it implemented, Nepal was to receive 500 million for electricity transmission and road infrastructure projects. This is the overlap I'm talking about. The Nepal Compact, again, is the first project in South Asia of MCC in itself. India, of course, has maintained that all of this is consultative, viability-driven, and partner-based. And similarly, India has done so with extending, sort of $1 billion line of credit for connectivity projects with the ASEAN. And a lot of projects are under discussion under this as well. India has been invited to join the US-led Build Back Better World initiative, and experts are examining India's opportunities to join the Blue Dot Network, which aims to grade infrastructure financing across the Indo-Pacific. It is said that, India needs to have a change in mind, and why the discussion is happening is because as an emerging economy and a rising Indo-Pacific power, India's quest for quality infrastructure domestically and search for finance to promote its connectivity across the immediate and extended neighborhood will make this network a natural choice. Now, finally, when, we are having a discussion on the AUKUS, etc., short of naming China, efforts at the UNGA, the AUKUS arrangements and Quad leadership summits, the new Quad, etc., all are aimed at augmenting collective strength to push back against unilateralism in multiple domains. But it's also to build habits of cooperation beyond China. India has often argued that if you look at the conversation around the Quadrilateral Dialogue itself, that the Quad mandate, limiting it to hard security will have a limited buy-in, because broadening scope of cooperation will also effect on sharp competition, as the Indian Foreign Minister has said. And, we've heard often from the Indian government that, the more platforms you have, the more people you work with, and the larger the consensus, and that's good. So I think, in a sense, preparedness, partnerships, and the promotion of a network region seem to be the way forward at the moment. I'll stop here, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shruti, for sharing your views. In fact, my takeaway from your deliberation is, being a student of international relations, it's very interesting to note where you have said about the scope for issue-based coalition or cooperation. It reminds me about way back in 1980s, early 1990s, when we were nurturing the ideas of functionalism and neo-functionalism based on cooperation in some functional aspects, with a kind of flexibility and the incremental decision making in our mind. So probably we will be waiting to see how this kind of flexible decision making structure can pave the way to have a concrete, consolidated institutional formation within the geographical space, which is Indo-Pacific. We have with us Satuli Mai. So we request Satuli Mai to share your views. So it's over to you.
Well, good morning from Washington. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, first of all, let me begin by saying good morning, but secondly, by offering apologies. I wish I could make up a fancy excuse for technology, et cetera, but I can't. I simply failed to get up on time, and I do apologize to everyone, despite setting numerous alarms. Look, time is short. Let me try to address at least 3 of the 5 questions that were offered to me. I'll be very quick because I've already heard some extraordinarily interesting insights from my colleagues on the panel. What are the prospects for functional cooperation in the Indo-Pacific? I think currently it's very difficult for me to be optimistic. If we've seen the responses to COVID, if we've seen the G20 meeting, if we've seen the recent G7 and we've seen COP26, I would say that while they are always important to continue efforts, it does not seem to me like we are making much headway either at the global level or at the regional level on significant functional cooperation. Of course, there's ongoing cooperation in a number of areas, smaller and larger. But in terms of the needs gap between what is needed in terms of functional cooperation and what is offered in terms of functional cooperation, I would say that the deficit is quite large. It's not that there is zero, because you can always find an example where something is going on. The question is, what is the gap between what is available and offered and accessible and what is needed? And I think my first point is that the functional cooperation is far less than it should or could or need be. Now, functional cooperation, of course, and here is a caveat and an example of something else that is going on. To me, functional cooperation in the Indo-Pacific is only one aspect or one side of a very complicated geometric shape. I don't quite know how many sides this shape has yet, of what I would call the regional integration project. And the regional integration project essentially began from the early 1990s, right? With the rise of the 4 tigers, quite frankly, China's accession to the WTO, the huge influx of Japanese capital, Japanese trade and Japanese investment into Southeast Asia, which really allowed folks to take off. I would refer you, I know I'm dating myself, but to the 1992-93 East Asia Miracle Report of the World Bank. I mean, a set of structural reforms at the national level, combined with globalization developments, combined with Japan's extraordinary role in leading to kickoff amongst the Four Tigers and some of the Southeast Asian countries, explains a regional integration project that now is, I think, at least in question, despite the fact that RCEP is coming into play and despite the fact that there is CPTPP. Both are fundamental to the regional integration project, but they are not sufficient to the regional integration project. Because while they are important, there are other trends that are driving us away from this 30 years of regional integration. One trend is the increasing contestation between the US and China on the economic front and decoupling and the fracturing of supply lines. Some countries may benefit, other countries may not benefit, but the simple point is we see that these divergences and trends for the overall globalization and regional integration project. The second is increasing, of course, COVID and the huge impacts that COVID has had and what the recovery and resilience of supply chains will look like, in my view, after that. So these are some of the contesting elements of the regional integration project. So I don't think it's important to see functional cooperation as some sort of mechanistic cooperation. I think it's important to see functional cooperation as embedded in this larger integration project, which binds countries of East Asia together. And I include in East Asia the United States, and of course Japan is intrinsic to that process. Second question: would geopolitical tensions contribute to increasing securitization in the Pacific? I can be very short: yes. If the Indo-Pacific is already being securitized, it's going to be securitized more. Stand by, hold on to your seats, tighten your belts, because here we go. Now, the world is full of surprises. And it's possible to conceive of some off-ramps or some managed competition and securitization, but I don't think so. And I certainly don't think so in any short-term period of time. In fact, it's likely to get much more intense before and if it gets better. Having said that, it's easy to talk about strategic competition, the increasing creation of lines. You know, I've heard my colleagues talk about AUKUS, et cetera. That's sort of more interesting to me is what's on the flip side of securitization that we pay less attention to, because all we're talking about is securitization and other issues. And let me just flag that, at least the way I look at things, we essentially have three potential or actual, depending on how you look at it, failed states across the region, from the west of the Indo-Pacific to the northeast of the Indo-Pacific. Afghanistan in the west, Myanmar in the middle, and North Korea potentially in the very northeast. So you could say that there's strategic competition, that it controls everything, that it's important, and I tend to agree. I would agree that it's the single largest dynamic shaping the security environment of the Indo-Pacific. But so too if Myanmar collapses into a failed state. So too if North Korea collapses into a failed state. And goodness only knows what the implications of Afghanistan are, given the spread of counterterrorism to Southeast Asia, terrorism and other developments to South Asia. And I'm quite sure that Afghanistan will distract India. I'm not sure it will divert India, but I would say it would distract India from a focus on East Asia. And then finally, of course, again, sorry to bring it up, but it's just simply true. Strategic competition in failed states, certainly, but COVID might actually be much worse for both, because COVID vaccine competition and other forms of competition around COVID are exacerbating securitization. And secondly, they're also exacerbating the failed state situation. See Myanmar, for example, in particular. Okay, and I don't know about North Korea. You get all kinds of reports. I'm not really sure how significant COVID is for the North Korean stability. Finally, what are the prospects for the trilateral and multilateral partnerships being forged? I think they're huge. The prospects are significant. The real question is, how do you knit this together into a cohesive? If there are so many of these minilaterals and multilaterals, and there are these ad hoc coalitions, how do you prosecute strategic competition? Well, the United States has made, in my view, a rather important choice. And that important choice is stick to allies you know very well, that you trust almost completely, never completely, but almost completely. And that includes Japan, which is very important to these discussions. It includes Australia. It includes the United Kingdom, which is somewhat of a new and old player in the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's a great link to allies. It's a great innovation to bridge together capabilities, assets, intelligence, and comfort levels amongst your key allies, wherever they be placed. It's, after all, a globalized world on the economic front. Why shouldn't it be a globalized world on the security front? As for Southeast Asian responses, I always listen to my colleague Colin with great care, and amongst others. And I've talked to colleagues in Malaysia and Indonesia and others. And I do think there are some concerns. There's some downstream concerns and potential inadvertent consequences. But we're talking, at least on the submarine front, of a 30, 40 year, 20 to 30 year timeline. The rather more interesting things for me to watch in the next year or two is which other countries dock on to AUKUS elements that are not related to submarines, because submarines are not going to be thrown about willy-nilly into the region, or even sought by everyone in the region. I would be shocked if I heard that Japan wanted nuclear-powered or nuclear-propulsed submarines, for example, given that they have quite good diesel ones. So those are my thoughts. I'm happy to take questions. And again, apologies to my very distinguished colleagues and the audience for being tardy this morning at now 5, almost 6 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Limai, for sharing your views. Yes, we know that it's too early to your place, and that we are especially grateful to you for participating and joining us in this early morning. I am very much interested to take 2 or 3 points forward. First one is, you have talked about the evaluation of gap that we have between the current situation of functional cooperation and the desired functional cooperation within this geographical domain of Indo-Pacific. This is number one. Number two, you have also stated that the importance of strategic competition within this geographical domain. And while discussing this, you have talked about the presence of failed state. As a student of international relations and worked on South Asia, we know that whenever we are posing this concept of failed state, Pakistan always comes to our mind. In this particular domain of Indo-Pacific, I would like to have all our distinguished speakers' perception towards this failed state notion so far, as Limai actually referring to Myanmar, North Korea, and Afghanistan. Well, with these a few questions now, I would like to request Daisuke for sharing your views. It's over to you, Daisuke.
Hello, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to begin by thanking Observer Research Foundation in Kolkata for kindly hosting me with distinguished panelists. And thank you, the Consulate General of Japan in Kolkata, for supporting this dialogue. So I'm delighted to offer my view on the Indo-Pacific from the Japan's perspective. And I will keep my remarks short and try to answer the Dr. Chowdhury's questions. In recent years, this region has been has seen substantive geopolitical shifts. Regarding Japan's engagement in the Indo-Pacific region, as Consul General Nakamura in the previous session and Dr. Chowdhury remarked, Japan has been promoting the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific since 2016. The FOIP aims to realize a free and open regional order based on the rule of law and shared fundamental values to achieve peace and prosperity for the entire regions. Those are promoting the maritime order, expanding free and fair economic cooperations, enhancing connectivity and strengthening the capacity building in the physical management, ensuring maritime security and maritime safety. A question worth asking is how the new Prime Minister Kishida will pursue Japan's foreign policy. I can say that the fillip will evolve because when this strategy began, Prime Minister Kishida was foreign minister at the time and confirmed the importance of a strategic global partnership with India. So he surely knows that how vital this region is, potentially better than any former prime minister. So turning to the Quad, the rise of China, the limit to what Japan can do, thus the Quad's importance. If you were to ask me what this year's narrative is, I would say it is a year of Quad. With the change in the United States administration, there were initial fears that fillip and the Quad would be discarded as Japan had. But on the contrary, the Biden administration has deepened its commitment to the Indo-Pacific. The Quad has strengthened to become the main driving force in the Indo-Pacific region, and a number of working groups have been established within Quad to provide a framework for substantial international public goods. Furthermore, the AUKUS has underlined US commitment and will enhance Australia's operational functionality. It can also be seen as a US projection of power to the region through Australia. The Quad and the AUKUS are main pillars for regional stability in that region, as Japan sees. If I had to describe the difference between Quad and AUKUS, I would say that they both cooperate on advanced technology, but have different objectives and approaches. The AUKUS is a rather exclusive mechanism. Technical cooperation is also essentially aimed at improving technology capabilities, including quantum computing and artificial intelligence. On the other hand, the Quad focuses on the cooperation of technology standardization, which is a strategy for dealing with China. And the Quad is very flexible, as many speakers said, and based on minilateral, so less formal coalition and alignment. So many countries, including ASEAN, can participate and cooperate on an issue-by-issue basis. So it is very inclusive. The fact that it does not mention China by name and adheres to ASEAN centrality makes it easier to gain support, including from ASEAN countries. Although China is not mentioned by name, its status as main competitor, but it's clear. To mention a few things about China, the current strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific is driven largely by Chinese military expansion. It has made a mistake in its foreign policy, I would say. China had been following the called Dongguan Yanghui policy, or keeping a low profile. So this was a very smart policy that made many countries believe that China would rise peacefully. However, it has adopted a more assertive and aggressive policy based on its own recognition of being a great power. The so-called warrior diplomacy, as you know. So thereby, providing the catalyst for the creation of Quad and the AUKUS. But the fact is that it is pursuing policies such as igniting the border issues and signing a secret agreement with Bhutan means that the Beijing is far from decoupling Indo-Pacific unity, I would say. To touch on Japan-India relations, as Dr. Jaishankar explained comprehensively, I do agree that we have the shared same strategic objectives, as both nations have territorial issues with China, and we are the two non-Anglo-Saxon countries within the Quad, so which also have space to cooperate while having strategic partnership. So finally, I'd like to talk briefly about Taiwan. Now, from a geopolitical point of view, the Taiwan Strait is undoubtedly the front line in the region. For Japan is also our concern, Taiwan is also our concern. That does not mean that Japan will directly dispatch the self-defense forces to defend Taiwan, but rather than the defense of Japan, which is very essential. Because if there is a Taiwanese emergency, it will likely be default become a Japanese emergency. Because first and foremost, if Japan's defense is not in order, the United States military will not be able to conduct Japan-based operations to defend Taiwan. Of course, it will be difficult to turn Taiwan issues into political issues for all Quad members. Yet, if we take a firm stance and promote the formation of order in the region, it will serve as a deterrent and enhance regional stability. This is my reading of the Indo-Pacific. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Daisuke, for sharing your views with us. While listening to you, one pertinent question, I think, which is obvious as well, to ask you or to raise this for our speakers, that do you think that the construction of Indo-Pacific may be regarded as a counter-narrative of BRI? Though it's a very common question nowadays, but I would like to, I'm sure all our participants would like to have your views on that, but we will take your views after Akriti shares her own views with us. It's over to you, Akriti.
Thank you so much, Dr. A. Chaudhary, and to the Observer Research Foundation and the Government of Japan for inviting me to speak at this excellent conference. And I'm really pleased to be on such a stellar panel. The trouble with going last with so many smart people is that most of my comments have already been covered. But what I'll try to do, and I'll be very brief, is just kind of focus my comments on the role that multilateral coalitions or, issue-based coalitions, as Shruti was mentioning, such as the Quad and the Quad Plus, how can they play to further cooperation and economic development and stability in the Indo-Pacific? And I think a lot of my comments will echo what everyone actually on the panel has said. So I just wanted to make sort of three brief points. I think first on the evolution of the role of the Quad in the Indo-Pacific region. I think it's important to remember that the Quad was actually envisioned at its foundation as a grouping of like-minded countries that would provide public goods in the region. And, this was after it proved to be successful because it was an ad hoc grouping that was coordinating responses to the Indian Ocean tsunami in December 2004. So I think it is, apropos, and it is in line with that vision at its foundation for the Quad to now have the agenda that it has, which is much more, positive, concrete, action-oriented, and, which is about sharing the responsibilities, burden of responsibilities in the region and offering practical solutions to regional and global challenges in the, Indo-Pacific. So, what Dhruva was saying earlier, the idea of sort of a network security architecture in Asia has existed for some time, at least since the mid-2000s with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe mentioning it, but also many US officials at the time. So I think now it's just you're seeing the existence of that coming, it's sort of coming to fruition much more. And it is largely driven by the increasingly aligned threat perceptions of the Quad members with regard to China and it's Chinese assertiveness in and its coercion of other countries in the Pacific. And I would argue that the Quad is increasingly becoming the key regional infrastructure architecture, in the Indo-Pacific to provide public goods, whether that's assistance, whether that's capacity building, whether that's training. It's putting the building blocks in place. I will not say obviously that it has a lot of meat on the bones just yet, but there are a lot of ideas on the table there. The second point that I wanted to make on, the Quad Plus, and maybe this touches a little bit on what Colin was saying earlier, is that I think what the Quad Plus was useful for, which is, it allowed countries in the region that had concerns about China to organize in a much more palatable way. Because the Quad Plus was essentially billed as a functional coalition that was going to discuss best practices to deal with COVID-19, it was easier for countries such as Vietnam or South Korea to join that that coordination call led by the US. But if you look closely at the issues that the Quad Plus actually just discussed or stressed, whether that was importance of resilient supply chains, whether that was managing misinformation, whether it was helping vulnerable countries with economic recovery in the post-pandemic period, all of that had a China subtext, so to speak. So I think what the Quad and the Quad Plus sort of coordination calls show is that countries in East and Southeast Asia have found some utility for these groupings. Obviously not all across the board, but it does provide some space for countries that are becoming increasingly concerned to have these conversations with the Quad, that is much more willing now to provide this cooperation and have these conversations. And I think when I say Quad Plus, I mean any kind of functional coalition that has the Quad at the center of it. So, that can include any other members, whether those are in Europe or in Southeast Asia or the Middle East. And I think that the key point, and at least my assessment, is that what the Quad is trying to do is build a complementarity of interests with other partners through various kind of configurations, based on issue areas like Shruti was saying earlier, in order to build the capacity of states in the Indo-Pacific that are targets of Chinese coercion, and to ensure prosperity and stability in the region. And this is being done in many different ways, through cooperation on the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly through the provision of vaccines, through developing infrastructure, whether that's disaster resilient infrastructure or digital infrastructure, through technical assistance of various kinds, through assistance in climate adaptation, resilience, and preparedness. And so I think, going forward, what we maybe need to see from both the Quad and the Quad Plus, like I was saying earlier, is a little bit more meat on the bones. I think there are a lot of ideas on the table. A lot of conversations have happened on space, on cybersecurity, infrastructure, like Shruti was mentioning earlier. But what we need to see is more sort of concrete projects coming out of it and linking it really to the concerns of the countries in the region and making sure, especially countries part of the ASEAN bloc, find utility in the solutions that are being provided by both the Quad and Quad Plus. So let me stop there because I know that we have very little time for Q&A, but I'm excited to hear what the audience has in store for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akriti, for sharing your views specifically on Quad and Quad Plus. I think COVID pandemic has given us this opportunity where we are seeing more functional cooperation in the name of Quad Plus and vaccine diplomacy. As we have very little time left in our hands, we have got one specific question, and this question is: how can the political economy of small island nations be assessed in the context of the increasing competition and cooperation in the Indian Ocean, specifically raising the issue of small island nations. It's not directed to any specific speaker, so I'm sure any one of you can take it up. And also, after these question, I would like to request all of you just for 2-3 minutes each, you can share your concluding remarks. And of course, I would like to have your views on this notion of failed state within Indo-Pacific, and again the ASEAN centrality in the context of failed state. Of course, ASEAN's reaction towards this failed states, specifically Myanmar, and of course I am hinting towards Rohingya issue. And the third one is also the question that I posed, that is whether we can take this construction of Indo-Pacific as counter narrative of BRI. It's over to you all. Dhruva, you can start.
There's a lot there. Thanks to all the other speakers. One of the advantages of going first is you can listen to everybody else and learn from everyone else's comments. A lot of food for thought. I'll just leave with sort of a few comments on some of the issues that have been raised, some of the questions that have been raised on it. Let's start with the Indo-Pacific versus BRI discussion. I think BRI. It's interesting. Both concepts, while unveiled, have taken on lives of their own and have become open to interpretation by different actors, including sometimes the actors that have been leading the effort. So both a little bit are like the proverbial elephants with the blind men of Hindustan. Everybody sees what they want to see in BRI and in the Indo-Pacific. But I don't think it's a like-to-like comparison. I don't think there's any, BRI had a very specific it was pooling together a number of pre-existing sort of large-scale infrastructure projects, some of which have progressed quite significantly since in the past decade or so. Others have not taken off as they had been anticipated to, and even within certain aspects of BRI, say the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, to give one example, the energy projects have progressed much more significantly, but other aspects have not. So I think that was very much a Chinese political initiative. It was done it was again one aspect of it was pooling several pre-existing efforts together. Another aspect was really giving it a sort of political branding, often for a domestic audience, and it was really in many cases about exporting excess Chinese capacity to other markets. So I think that was the effort. There has been a sort of different levels of disillusionment. Even China now speaks about it a little less in some ways than it did a few years ago, which is quite telling. And it has also elements of it have also been further derailed by the coronavirus pandemic and the credit crunch as well. So I don't think the Indo-Pacific is purely a response to that. It is, I think, a defined strategic concept. China is very much part of the Indo-Pacific. It's active in the strategic space that is the Indo-Pacific, even if China does not use officially the vocabulary that has been adopted by a wide range of other countries. So I don't think it's really an apples to apples comparison. These are two very different ideas and constructs, no matter how they are interpreted. There have been other efforts to compete with BRI. I think Japan has really led. As recently as a couple of years ago, Japan's stock of overseas development assistance was in fact about the same as China's, yet to much less fanfare. India's is about 1/13 of what China has done, but it's there. The U.S. in many cases is involved in the U.S. private sector is involved in a big way, but not the U.S. government as much, despite efforts such as the Build Act in the U.S. There have been efforts at sort of competing, if you will, with BRI, but I would not frame it strictly in terms of an Indo-Pacific framework. In terms of small island states in the Indian Ocean, I think it would be interesting to look at two different clusters of states. I would say that people like Darshana Barua at Carnegie are doing some very interesting work on island nations. But one is the cluster Mauritius, Seychelles, Madagascar, and the Comoros, where France has a very big role, particularly with the presence of Réunion, where India, and particularly Mauritius, has a sort of certain privileged security partnership. But you have a country like Seychelles, which is open to engaging with a lot of different actors. So that I think is one area where we are seeing a sort of engagement by India, France, to a lesser degree other countries, and even in China and places like Seychelles. The other sort of cluster would be closer to South Asia, Sri Lanka and Maldives particularly, where India obviously plays a big role. China now plays a very significant role, but even the US and Japan as well. So I think we are seeing in some ways the geopolitical competition having implications for these countries, although all of the countries I mentioned seem to be approaching this in slightly different ways. And again, a similar dynamic is underway in the South Pacific, although often with a different cluster of actors, including Australia and New Zealand, France, the United States, China, and Japan. And in many cases, these are test cases for multilateral cooperation. As I mentioned, Sri Lanka is one where India and Japan had attempted to work together in the Colombo Port project. But even in the Pacific, we're seeing, Palau and Papua New Guinea, places, most people would not think of as centers of geopolitical competition, as being test cases for US, Japan, Australia coordination on infrastructure financing. My final point, I guess, will relate a little bit to what Akriti said at the end on the Quad being a lot of ideas. I think if you were to, take a look at the joint statement that was released after the latest Quad summit, there's actually quite a lot of very specific initiatives that have been announced. And again, it's all been in the last year, so it's very soon to say. It's too soon to assess whether these are successful or have taken off. And implementation, there are many question marks about it. But these aren't sort of in the vague realm of ideas anymore. These are actual concrete efforts that have now been officially announced by the four governments jointly, from relatively small scale efforts such as the Quad Fellowship to sometimes much more significantly ambitious efforts. I think the first big test case will really be the joint vaccine effort, which we'll see by early 2022, whether the rollout is as it is hoped to be. But I would say there's now quite a lot of meat on the bone, to use that analogy. And again, we'll have to see, a year from now, whether some of those have really started to reap benefits. And again, these are just the ones that have been publicly announced. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dhruva. Colin, it's over to you. We don't have much time in our hands, so please, you can share your concluding remarks. Yes.
Yeah, I will probably take just 1 minute, hopefully, simply to address the question on the BRI. And I totally concur with what Dhruva has said about the BRI. If anything, and you'll find some prominent mention about sustainable development. So I think, in a way, Southeast Asian countries, while they really wish to, write on the benefits of BRI, but they're at the same time also very cognizant of the debt trap controversy. I think this is, in a way, controversial, not just from the geopolitical perspective, but domestically, it could be a problem. So I think, this is something to think about. And of course, BRI is also China's version of its Indo-Pacific outreach. If you look at, the predominant focus of, the key partnerships that China is cultivating for this initiative. But I think if we look beyond that, the BRI is more than the Indo-Pacific. It is a global initiative, in fact. I mean, you look at it stretching beyond Indo-Pacific into Europe and stretching right into Latin America and looking at very different frameworks with very different ambitions. But at the same time, some other countries, Indo-Pacific strategies may come across as anti-China, whether you like it or not. I mean, look at Southeast Asia. I think you can't go away with the thinking in Southeast Asia that some of those competing Indo-Pacific concepts seem to have an anti-China containment element in mind. So they are very mindful not to endorse them back from cooperating with these major stakeholders in the region. So with that, thank you so much, Dr. Anaswa.
Thank you. Now it's turn, Limai, to share your concluding remarks.
Yes, again, thank you so much to ORF and the Japanese consulate, and of course to my fellow panelists, colleagues. 3 questions were posed to me: gap between functional needs and availability, I've done some work on the Eastern Bay of Bengal connectivity, and I must tell you that connectivity is hard work. That's why I spoke a lot about the Regional Integration Project. There have been infrastructure projects, multimodal transport vectors around the Bay of Bengal for decades. They are moving forward, but at a relatively modest pace. And now with the conditions in Myanmar, it makes the completion of those even more difficult. Second of all, if you look at the trade statistics across the Bay of Bengal, just as an example, with regional countries, it's extraordinarily limited, except for the India-Bangladesh case. And even there, it's quite narrow and quite focused. So, connectivity is a project. Regional integration is a project. It can have setbacks. It can have declines. So I would continue to flag that need is just enormous for functional cooperation. And the functional cooperation is not only about dollars and infrastructure. It's really about connections, about people and ideas as well. Those are critical to socialize those connections. I would say that one thing, whatever demerits ASEAN has been phenomenal in trying to link its officials, its scholars, its business people. It isn't perfect, nor is the EU for that matter. Nor is the North American Free Trade Agreement perfect, but a very good job, and I continue to believe that it has some examples that could be quite useful. On failed states, I was deliberately provocative. It's easy to be provocative at 5 a.m. Because you haven't tested your ideas to the light of day yet in Eastern Daylight Time. But I will tell you this. Securitization, as I said, please don't misunderstand. It is the driving dynamic of the current strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific. I do not expect it to abate anytime soon. I'm simply saying that if we only focus about strategic competition, we might well miss other things that are going on. And I look at the region and I think, oh my goodness, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and North Korea, you should worry a lot. You should worry about big Southeast Asian states which have a lot of COVID. I mean, you could see what this has done to states in the heart of Europe, what it's doing to Russia, what it's did, and it has done recently to the United States, my own country. So let's not be, securitization is big, but unless we get COVID and socioeconomic recovery back, strategic competition is not going to be on the front place of politicians who are going to be grappling for staying in office. Small island states I'll leave to others, but the Pacific is a really interesting example, as Dhruva mentioned. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's over to you, Shruti.
Thanks very much. Quickly, Dhruva mentions geopolitical competition and hence coordination becoming very key, especially when we're talking about issues facing, small island nations. And if you look at the Indian Ocean in particular, stuff like I talked about, which the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative covers, whether it's disaster management, climate crisis, renewable energy, etc., areas where we already have blueprints in place and now we've got to deliver. On the question of BRI versus Indo-Pacific, I think that's, you're too generalizing an argument. But at the end of the day, you're talking about a struggle for influence. But so countries, when we're talking about new connectivity initiatives like India, we will have to look is how do we offer alternatives to countries, and how do we reconcile these new projects, especially since a lot of the recipient countries already have BRI projects which are already underway, which don't have these terms of financing that we want to put forward in terms of transparency, etc. So how are we going to convince these, and where's the money coming from? So that's, I think, remains the challenge as we go forward. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, Daisuke, please say a few words as your concluding remarks.
Very briefly. So regarding BRI's notion, just quickly, from a Chinese point of view, having discussed with the Chinese scholars and officials, China sees Indo-Pacific as a counterweight measures to BRI. So that's why China never used the Indo-Pacific as a formal concept. And as I'm in charge of the CSCAP, Council for Asia-Pacific Security Cooperation, Indo-Pacific words never have been approved by Chinese, government and think tanks. So this is, from Chinese perspective. And regarding failed nations, failed states, when it comes to North Korea, it really depends on the South Korea, situation. So South Korea will have a new president in next May. And if Conservative Party won the election, the situation will change. And so that's why I suppose Japanese government is also waiting for that result. And regarding Myanmar, Japan has a very unique connection with military. And so the United States very much knows about this fact. So, the Biden administration advocates the human rights, but they have never, imposed maximum pressures, economic sanction towards Myanmar, because they know the, diplomacy is undergoing. And finally, about the mini, small islands in the Pacific. So Japan, the Suga administration launched the Pacific Bond Strategy, which enhances the connectivity in the Pacific Islands. So, help building connectivity and the economic infrastructures and economy, and by having, the cooperation from the Quad as well. So this is what Suga said. So, I think that these Pacific Islands, like Fiji and Papua New Guinea, have the hope, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, Apriti, it's your turn.
Very, very quickly, since we are over time, I had a few points to make about, the importance of bilateral relations despite the importance of multilateral coalitions and disaster management as an area of cooperation in the region. But I'll put those aside and just respond to what Dhruva was saying. I think when I said, meat on the bones with regard to Quad, I meant on the implementation side. I think there's been a lot of progress on the Quad in the last 2 years. And I've been a big proponent of the Quad myself, but I think I was talking mainly about a lot of the initiatives that are put on the table. How do they actually come to implementation? But I'll end with that, and thank you so much for having me.
As we don't have much time in our hand, actually we are overshooting, so I will not summarize. I will keep it as it is, and I'm sure like me, all of you have enjoyed a lot. We have loads of issues and aspects on our table, food for thought, and we will request all of you to attend our next 2 major sessions, and also the valedictory session, and of course the major business sessions, next 2 business sessions, which will cover different aspects on commerce and connectivity, as well as concerns and engagements. With these few words, definitely I'm so happy to moderate these very engaging and very thought-provoking interactions. So thank you so much. Hope to have you again with us in our next program. Thanks a lot.